At 4:40 p.m. on March 25, 1911, a fire started on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in New York City. The building stood at the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park in Manhattan. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the workday was nearly over. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company occupied the top 3 floors of the 10-story building, the 8th, 9th, and 10th. The company manufactured women's blouses, called shirtwaists. About 500 people worked there, most of them young immigrant women, many from Jewish and Italian families. Some were as young as 14. Everything seemed normal that afternoon. The sewing machines were running. The cutters were at their tables. The foremen were watching the clock. Then something was off. On the 8th floor, a cutter named Giuseppe Rossi noticed a flickering glow near a bin of scrap fabric. The bin held thousands of pounds of cotton cuttings, oil-soaked and flammable. Rossi tried to beat out the flames with his hands, then with a piece of cloth. It did not work. The fire spread up the walls, catching the hanging patterns made of thin tissue paper. Within seconds, the entire 8th floor was in flames. The building had no automatic sprinklers. The only fire extinguishers were useless against the speed of the blaze. There was no fire alarm system. The factory had one wooden fire escape, and it was rickety and narrow. At 4:42, 2 minutes after ignition, the fire had already climbed through the open windows and up the outside of the building. The flames licked at the 9th floor windows above. Inside the 9th floor workroom, the sewing machines were still running. The workers did not yet know what was happening below. The foreman on the 9th floor, Samuel Bernstein and others, heard shouting from the street. People were pointing up. Bernstein looked out a window and saw smoke rising from the 8th floor. He yelled for everyone to stop working and get out, but the doors to the stairs were locked. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, had ordered the doors locked from the outside to prevent workers from taking breaks or stealing time. On the 9th floor, the main door to the Washington Place stairwell was bolted shut. The only other staircase, the Green Street stairwell, was narrow and already filling with smoke from the 8th floor. The workers on the 9th floor had one other exit, a single freight elevator, but it could only carry a few people at a time. At 4:44, the women on the 9th floor began to panic. They rushed to the locked door. They pounded on it. No one came. They tried the Green Street stairwell, but smoke was pouring up from below. The fire escape was at the rear of the building, a narrow iron ladder that zigzagged down to a closed courtyard. The first workers to reach the fire escape climbed down. The weight of the fleeing workers, combined with the heat, caused the fire escape to collapse. It tore away from the building and fell onto the courtyard below, killing several people instantly. By 4:45, the fire had reached the 9th floor. The flames came through the windows, igniting the fabric and the wooden floors. The workers had nowhere to go. The elevators were still running, operated by men like Joseph Zito and others. Zito made trip after trip, carrying as many as 12 people at a time, but the elevator could hold only so many. The women waiting for the elevator grew desperate. They pushed and shoved. Some were trampled. At 4:46, the heat became unbearable. Some women climbed onto the window ledges. They stood there 13 stories above the street with flames behind them and a long drop below. Then they began to jump. The first jumper was seen at 4:47. The crowd on the street watched in horror. The fire department had arrived, but their ladders only reached the 7th floor. The nets they held could not catch people falling from the 9th floor. One net broke under the impact of a body. The firemen watched, helpless. The jumps continued for several minutes. One woman jumped while holding her friend's hand. Another woman paused, then threw herself outward. The bodies piled up on the sidewalk. The sounds of the impact were audible over the roar of the fire. A reporter from the New York World later wrote that the street looked like a battlefield. At 4:50, the elevators stopped running. The cables had been damaged by the heat, or the shafts became impassable. No one knows exactly when the last elevator trip was made. On the 9th floor, the remaining workers were trapped in a corner near the Green Street windows. The flames advanced. The door to the roof was accessible only through a small hatch, and only a few managed to climb onto the roof. Some were rescued by students and faculty from nearby New York University, who extended ladders across the gap between buildings. At 4:52, the fire had consumed most of the ninth floor. The few workers still alive were huddled in the back. They broke windows and tried to climb down the outside of the building using the iron shutters. Some fell, others were burned. At 4:55, the fire reached the 10th floor. The owners, Blank and Harris, were on the 10th floor with their families. They escaped through the Green Street stairwell, which was still passable above the 8th floor. They made it to the roof and then to safety. The workers on the 10th floor also fled, but the stairwell was narrow and many were trapped. Some climbed onto the roof and were rescued by ladders. At 4:58, the fire was mostly under control. The firefighters had managed to contain the blaze to the top 3 floors, but the damage was done. The 9th floor was a charred shell. The bodies lay on the sidewalk in the courtyard and on the floors of the factory. By 5 p.m., the count had begun. The final number was 146 dead. Most were women. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 43. The cause of death varied: burns, smoke inhalation, broken bones from jumping, or crushing from the collapse of the fire escape. What happened? The fire itself was not unusual. Factory fires were common in 1909. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire became one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history because of the conditions inside the building. The workers had no way out. The doors were locked. The fire escape broke. The elevators stopped. The windows were too high, and the fire spread too fast. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company was located in the Ash Building, which had been built in 1909. The building was considered modern and fireproof, but the fireproofing applied only to the structure, not the contents. The floors were wood. The walls were wood. The ceilings were wood. The scraps of fabric that lay everywhere were like kindling. The factory had no sprinkler system. It had no fire alarm. It had no fire drills. The only fire extinguishers were small and ineffective. The company employed about 500 workers, mostly young immigrant women from Italy and Eastern Europe. They worked 6 days a week from early morning until evening. They earned between $6 and $10 a week. They were paid by the piece, meaning the faster they sewed, the more they earned. The factory was loud, dusty, and crowded. The aisles between machines were narrow. The tables were piled high with fabric. There was no space to move quickly. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were well known in the garment industry. They were called the Shirtwaist Kings. They had been involved in earlier labor disputes, including a major strike in 1909 known as the Uprising of the 20-00. During that strike, workers demanded better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Blank and Harris had resisted. They hired strikebreakers and fought the union. The strike ended with some gains, but the Triangle factory remained non-union. The workers who returned to the factory after the strike did not get safer conditions. How could this have happened? The investigators who arrived after the fire found a long list of failures. The building had been inspected in 1910 by the New York Fire Department. The inspectors noted that the fire escape was in poor condition, but no action was taken. The building was considered up to code because the code at the time did not require sprinklers or multiple means of egress. The locked doors were illegal, but no one had enforced the law. The owners said the doors were locked to prevent theft, but the workers had complained for months that the doors were bolted. The foreman had keys, but on the day of the fire the keys were not used in time. On the 9th floor, the door to the Washington Place stairwell was locked from the outside with a heavy bolt. Inside, there was no handle. Workers could not open it. They could only wait for someone to unlock it from the hallway. When the fire broke out, the foreman on the 9th floor, Samuel Bernstein, tried to unlock the door, but the key did not work. He broke the glass panel on the door and tried to reach the bolt, but the door was warped by heat and would not budge. He managed to open it later, but by then many had already jumped. The Green Street stairwell was not locked, but it was narrow. It also had a door at the 8th floor that opened inward, which was a further obstruction. When workers from the ninth floor tried to descend, they met the smoke and flames rising from the eighth. They turned back. Some tried to go up to the roof. The roof hatch was accessible only by a ladder, and the hatch itself was small. Only about 20 people made it to the roof. The rest were trapped. The fire escape was a nightmare. It was a single, narrow iron structure that ran down the back of the building. It was not designed to carry the weight of dozens of people fleeing a fire. The bolts holding it to the building pulled out. The ladder collapsed at the second floor level, sending dozens of workers into the courtyard below. The courtyard was enclosed by a high fence, and the fire escape had no access to the street. Even if it had held, the workers would have been trapped in the courtyard. The elevators were operated by two men, Joseph Zito and another operator. Zito made repeated trips, carrying as many as 12 people per trip. He was credited with saving many lives, but the elevator cables were not fireproofed. The shafts were open and acted as chimneys. The heat from the fire below eventually disabled the machinery. The last trip was made around 4:48 or 4:49. After that, the elevators stopped, and the only way down was the stairs or the windows. The fire department arrived within minutes of the first alarm. The alarm was turned in by a passerby on the street at 4:45, but the department's equipment was limited. The highest ladder could reach only the 7th floor. The nets could not catch jumpers from 9 stories above. The water pressure was insufficient to reach the top floors. The firefighters did what they could, but they were powerless. The dead were not just statistics. They were people with names and faces. The youngest victim was Catherine Maltese, age 14. She had started working at the factory only a few weeks before the fire. Her body was identified by a piece of jewelry. Another victim was Kate Leone, age 21. She was engaged to be married. Her fiancé survived by jumping from the 9th floor and landing on a fireman's net, but he was badly injured. He later identified her by her shoes. There were mothers, daughters, sisters. Many of them were the sole breadwinners for their families. Their deaths left entire communities in mourning. The day after the fire, the New York newspapers ran photographs of the bodies laid out in rows on the street. The images were shocking. The public outcry was immediate and enormous. A funeral procession for the victims drew tens of thousands of mourners. The families of the dead demanded justice. The owners, Blank and Harris, were arrested and charged with manslaughter. The trial began in December 1909. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution argued that the owners knew the doors were locked and did nothing about it. The defense argued that the doors were not locked at the time of the fire, or if they were, the owners had no intention of harming anyone. The jury was all white men, many of them businessmen. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for about an hour and a half. They returned a verdict of not guilty. Blank and Harris walked free. But the verdict did not end the story. The fire had ignited a movement. The families of the victims, along with labor activists, pushed for new laws. The New York State Legislature formed the Factory Investigating Commission, led by Robert F. Wagner and Francis Perkins. The commission held hearings, inspected factories, and wrote new safety regulations. Over the next few years, New York passed some of the strongest workplace safety laws in the country. Other states followed. The fire became a catalyst for the modern labor movement. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire matters today because it is not just history. The conditions that caused the fire still exist in parts of the world. The locked doors, the lack of fire escapes, the crowded floors, the indifference of employers to the safety of workers. The same kinds of tragedies happen in garment factories, chemical plants, and warehouses, often in places where labor laws are weak or unenforced. The fire is a reminder that progress is fragile and that the fight for safe working conditions never ends. What the workers on the 9th floor experienced in those 18 minutes is almost impossible to imagine. The heat, the smoke, the chaos, the terror of being trapped, the final choice between fire and the fall. They had no voice in the conditions where they worked. They had no power to change the locked door. They only had the hope that someone would come, or that the elevator would not stop, or that the fire escape would hold. None of those hopes were fulfilled. The building still stands. It is now the Joseph J. and Violet Jacobs Building at New York University. The ninth floor is occupied by chemistry labs. The windows overlook the park. There is a plaque on the facade, but it is easy to miss. Inside, there is little trace of what happened. But the memory persists in the names of the dead, in the laws they inspired, and in the stories that still need to be told. At 9:40 a.m. on March 26, 1911, 3 days after the fire, the coroner's investigation began in a makeshift morgue set up at the East 26th Street Pier. The bodies of 146 victims had been laid out in rows. Families walked through the pier, searching for their loved ones. The identification process was slow and painful. Many bodies were burned beyond recognition. Others had been crushed by the fall. Clothes were used for identification: a piece of lace, a button, a shoe, a lock of hair. The coroner, Dr. James A. Jenkins, asked each witness to describe what they remembered. The testimony was recorded in longhand. No photographs were allowed inside the morgue, but reporters were everywhere. They wrote down names, ages, addresses. The list grew by the hour. At 2:15 p.m. that same afternoon, the first public outrage took shape. A crowd of 5,000 gathered outside the factory building on Washington Place. They were mostly workers from nearby factories. They carried signs. They demanded the arrest of the owners. Police formed a line across the street. There was no violence, but the mood was tense. Speakers climbed onto wooden crates and shouted about the locked doors. One speaker was Rose Schneiderman, a labor activist and former factory worker. She had been involved in the uprising of the 2000. Her voice carried over the crowd. She said, "This is not the first time a factory has burned. It will not be the last. The system is the fire." Her words were printed in the next day's newspapers. They were read across the country. What happened next was a political earthquake. On March 28, 1911, the New York State Legislature announced the formation of a joint committee to investigate factory conditions. It was called the Factory Investigating Commission. The chairman was State Senator Robert F. Wagner. The vice chairman was Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith. The chief investigator was a young social worker named Frances Perkins. She had witnessed the fire from a nearby building and had seen the bodies falling. She never forgot that image. The commission had subpoena power. It could enter any factory, inspect any building, call any witness. The hearings began in April 1911 and continued for the next 4 years. At the first hearing, held on April 5, 1911, at the New York City Hall, Frances Perkins presented her initial findings. She had visited dozens of factories in the previous week. She described floors so crowded that workers could barely move. She described doors that opened inward, not outward. She described fire escapes that ended in locked courtyards. She described elevators with no fire protection. She described stairwells filled with cloth scraps and oil. The legislators listened. The room was silent. Then Robert Wagner asked her, "Were these conditions common?" She replied, "They were standard. The Triangle factory was not an outlier. It was typical." On April 12, 1911, the commission heard from the survivors. Among them was Samuel Bernstein, the foreman on the ninth floor who had tried to unlock the door. He testified that the key had failed. He also testified that he had complained to the owners about the locked doors several times in the months before the fire. He was told not to worry about it. He said the owners had a rule: no unauthorized entry, no theft. The door was locked to protect the goods. The goods were shirtwaists. The workers were considered expendable. His testimony was damning. But when he finished, the defense attorneys for Blank and Harris cross-examined him. They asked him why he had not broken the door down earlier. He said he had no tools. They asked if he had ever seen the owners personally lock the door. He said no, but the order came from them. The jury in the criminal trial would hear similar testimony months later. On May 18, 1911, the commission held a hearing at the factory building itself. They walked through the ninth floor. The floor was still charred. The machines were still in place. The elevator shafts were open. The fire escape was a twisted pile of metal in the courtyard. The doors were still locked. The commission took measurements. They noted that the stairwell was 30 inches wide. That was not enough for a crowd. They noted that the fire escape had a ladder at the bottom that could not reach the ground. They noted that the roof hatch was only 2 feet by 2 feet. The commission members were photographed standing in the doorway. The images were published in newspapers. The public saw what the workers had faced. How could this have happened? The answer lay in the system of inspections. In New York City, factory inspections were handled by the fire department, the building department, and the labor bureau. But there was little coordination. The fire department inspected only certain buildings. The building department inspected only for structural safety. The Labor Bureau had only 5 inspectors for the entire city. That meant 25,000 factories were each inspected once every 15 years. The Triangle factory had been inspected in 1900. The inspector noted that the fire escape was wobbly and that there was no sprinkler system. He wrote a report. The report was filed. No follow-up was conducted. The law at the time allowed the inspector to order repairs, but he had no authority to force the owner. He could only request, and the owner could ignore the request. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were arrested on April 12, 1911, at their office. They were charged with manslaughter in the first degree. The charge was based on the locked door on the 9th floor. The law stated that employers could not lock exit doors during working hours. The prosecution argued that Blank and Harris had directed the foreman to lock the doors. The defense argued that the foreman had acted on their own. The trial began on December 4, 1911, at the New York Supreme Court in Manhattan. The courtroom was packed. The judge was Thomas C.T. Crane. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Charles S. Whitman. The defense was led by Max Steuer, one of the most famous trial lawyers of the era. What the jury heard was a battle of narratives. The prosecution called 30 witnesses. Among them were workers who testified that the doors were always locked. One worker, Ida Kessler, said she had seen the foreman pull the bolt into place every morning. Another worker, Abe Gordon, said he had been locked in the stairwell twice before the fire. The prosecution argued that the owners knew. The defense cross-examined each witness carefully. Max Steuer was known for his skill with witnesses. He often repeated questions until the witness became confused. He used this technique on Ida Kessler. He asked her if she was sure the door was locked. She said yes. He asked her if she could describe the lock. She did. He asked her if the lock was a padlock or a bolt. She said a bolt. He asked her if she had ever seen the key. She said there was no key, just a bolt on the outside. He paused. Then he asked, then how could the foreman lock it from the inside if the bolt was on the outside? She hesitated. She said she did not know. The jury took note. The defense was planting doubt. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On December 27, 1911, the jury began deliberation at 10:15 a.m. They returned at 11:50 a.m. the verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cried. Others shouted. The judge called for order. The foreman of the jury read the verdict again. Blank and Harris stood silent. They had faced the possibility of 15 years in prison. Now they were free. They walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of protesters. The protesters threw stones. Police escorted the owners to a waiting car. They drove away. The legal system had failed to hold them accountable, but the public had not forgotten. In the months after the trial, the Factory Investigating Commission continued its work. It held more than 60 hearings across New York State. It inspected more than 2,000 factories. It collected thousands of pages of testimony. The commission proposed new laws. The first was the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, passed in 1900. It required factories to have automatic sprinkler systems in buildings above a certain height. It required fire drills. It required unlocked exit doors that opened outward. It required fire escapes that were strong enough and that led to the street. The second was the Wagner Labor Law, passed in 1903. It limited the working hours of women and children. It required 1 day of rest per week. It established a new state agency to enforce factory safety. The third was the Workmen's Compensation Law, passed in 1914, which required employers to compensate workers injured on the job. These laws did not happen by accident. They happened because of the fire, because of the bodies on the street, because of the families who spoke out, because of Frances Perkins, who later became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt. She carried the memory of the Triangle Fire into the New Deal. She helped write the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the National Labor Relations Act. She said, "The tragedy of the Triangle Fire was the turning point in my life. I decided that I had to do something about the conditions that had caused it." The fire also changed the labor movement. In 1911, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union had about 20,000 members. By 1915, it had more than 100,000. The Triangle Fire became a recruiting tool. Union organizers used the images of the dead to argue for collective bargaining. They said, "If you want safe conditions, you need a union. The owners will not give it to you voluntarily." Many workers agreed. The union gained strength. It pushed for contracts that included fire safety clauses. It hired its own inspectors. It published reports on dangerous factories. The owners began to pay attention, not because they cared, but because they feared the union and the law. But not everyone benefited. The families of the victims received little compensation. The owner's insurance company paid out about $60,000 to the families. That was about $400 per death. Some families had to sue to get even that. Blank and Harris also collected insurance money. They filed claims for the loss of the building and the goods inside. They were paid. They reopened a new factory on the same street within 2 years. The new factory had safety improvements. But the owners did not change their attitude. They continued to resist unions. They continued to fight new regulations. They made large donations to political campaigns. They remained wealthy. They remained unpunished. The building at 2329 Washington Place survived. It was sold. It became a college building by 1905. The interior was rebuilt. The ninth floor was renovated. The windows were replaced. The doorway where the Gate of Cinders once stood was sealed. The plaques that were later added on the facade said, "In memory of the 146 workers who died here." But the first plaque was not installed until 1961, 50 years after the fire. By then, most of the survivors were old. Some had died. The fire had become a footnote in history books. It was not taught in schools. It was not remembered by younger generations. But then, in the 1990s, a new generation rediscovered the Triangle Fire. Labor historians wrote books. Documentaries were made. The Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition was formed in 2008. They pushed for a permanent memorial. In 2011, the 100th anniversary, a memorial was dedicated. It is located at the site in the park next to the building. The memorial consists of a steel ribbon engraved with the names of the victims. There is a 9-foot-high panel that tells the story. There is a garden of flowers. Every year on March 25th, a ceremony is held. The names are read aloud. A bell is tolled for each name. The solemn rhythm of the bell echoes what the fire alarms could not do that afternoon. The legacy of the Triangle Fire is not only in labor laws and memorials. It is in the understanding that workplace safety is a human right. It is in the knowledge that systems can fail, but people can force change. It is in the stories of the dead, who were not just statistics. They were 14-year-old Catherine Maltese, who dreamed of being a teacher. She was the youngest victim. She had been working at the factory for only 3 weeks. Her mother had brought her lunch every day. On March 25th, her mother waited at the door. Catherine never came out. She was found in the stairwell. There was Joseph Rosen, a 20-year-old tailor. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He had worked at the factory for 2 years. He had complained about the locked doors. On the day of the fire, he tried to escape through the Green Street stairwell. He was found at the bottom, crushed. His wife gave birth to a daughter 3 months later. She named the girl Josephina. There was Fanny Lansner, age 28. She was a supervisor on the 9th floor. She had been with the company for 10 years. She was known for her calm demeanor. When the fire started, she tried to calm the workers, directed them to the elevators. She stayed behind to help others. She did not survive. Her body was identified by her wedding ring. There was Mary Leventhal, age 18. She was a new immigrant from Russia. She spoke little English. She lived with her aunt in a tenement on the Lower East Side. She sent most of her wages home to her parents. On March 25th, she was at her sewing machine when the fire alarm sounded. She ran to the door. It was locked. She ran to the window. She jumped. She died instantly. The 18 minutes on the ninth floor have been reconstructed by historians. They have interviewed survivors and read testimony. They have timed the sequence of events. The fire started at approximately 4:40 p.m. It was sparked by a discarded match or a cigarette. The rags in the scrap bin ignited. The fire spread to the wooden tables. The flames reached the ceiling. The workers on the 8th floor smelled smoke. They began to move toward the doors. On the 9th floor, the fire broke out silently. The first workers saw the flames leaping from the 8th floor through the windows. The foreman shouted for everyone to leave. The doors were locked. The drop was 9 stories. Between 4:41 and 4:44, the workers tried to escape. The elevators made 3 trips. The fire escape collapsed at 4:45. The first jumper went out the window at approximately 4:46. The fire department arrived at 4:47. The last jumper fell at 4:58. At 4:59, the fire reached the 9th floor. The remaining workers were trapped in the back. The flames consumed them. By 5, it was over. The number of dead is usually given as 146. That number has been debated. Some sources say 145. The discrepancy comes from a victim who died later in the hospital or a small child who was not officially counted. The names of the dead were compiled by the Red Cross. The list included a woman who was pregnant. The baby was also counted. The total is 146 individuals, each with a name and a story. The fire also changed the way Americans think about fire safety. In the years after 1911, building codes were rewritten. New York City passed a law requiring self-closing doors that opened outward. It required fire drills in all factories. It required that fire escapes be made of steel, not iron. It required that they have access to the street. It required that no door be locked during working hours. These laws were enforced. Inspections increased. The number of factory fires decreased. The Triangle Fire became the template for fire safety reform. But the fire did not end the problem of dangerous factories. In 1912, the Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts drew attention to child labor and unsafe conditions. In 1915, the Ford Motor Company plant fire in Detroit killed 10 workers. In 1918, the Standard Oil fire in Bayonne, New Jersey killed 17. In 1921, the Knights of Columbus building fire in Chicago killed 30. The Triangle Fire was not the last, but it was the first to capture national attention. It was the first to lead to widespread reform. It set a precedent. Today, the building is part of New York University, used for academic research. The 9th floor is a chemistry laboratory. The windows overlook Washington Square Park. The students who walk into that building rarely know what happened there, but the flames are not forgotten. They are remembered every time a worker files a complaint about a locked door. They are remembered every time a fire inspector checks a factory. They are remembered every year on March 25th, when the names are read aloud. What the workers on the 9th floor experienced in those 18 minutes is almost impossible to imagine. The heat, the smoke, the chaos, the terror of being trapped, the final choice between fire and fall. They had no voice in the conditions where they worked. They had no power to change the locked door. They only had the hope that someone would come, or that the elevator would not stop, or that the fire escape would hold. None of those hopes were fulfilled, but their deaths were not meaningless. The laws that followed their deaths have saved many more than 146 lives. The labor movement that grew out of their deaths gave power to millions of workers. The memory of their deaths continues to remind us that progress is fragile, that the fight for safe working conditions never ends, and that the cost of forgetting is measured in bodies. So when we walk past that building at Washington Place, we should remember the 18 minutes. We should remember the girls who jumped. We should remember the doors that were locked. We should remember the key that was never used in time. And we should ask, what locked doors exist today? In what factories, in what warehouses, in what countries, on what floors, are workers still trapped by indifference, by greed, by the belief that profit is worth the risk? That question is the legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It is not a historical question. It is a living one. To understand how that living question persists, we need to examine what happened in the years immediately after the fire, the legal battles, the political fights, and the slow, painful process of turning grief into law. On April 5, 1911, less than 2 weeks after the fire, a grand jury in New York County indicted Max Blank and Isaac Harris, the owners of the Triangle Waste Company, on charges of manslaughter. The specific charge was that they had locked the door on the 9th floor, knowing it would prevent escape. The indictment named only one victim, Margaret Schwartz, a young woman whose body was found near the locked door. The law at the time required a specific victim for a manslaughter charge. Harris and Blank were arrested and held on $25,000 bail each. The public expected a swift conviction, but the trial did not begin until December 4, 1911. That 8-month gap allowed the defense to prepare. Blank and Harris hired Max Steuer, one of the most skilled trial lawyers in New York. Steuer was known for his ability to confuse witnesses and undermine emotional testimony. The prosecution was led by Charles S. Whitman, the district attorney, who was also running for governor. The case was tried before Judge Thomas C.T. Crane in the New York Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed each day with reporters, labor activists, and family members of the victims. The prosecution's case rested on the testimony of survivors who had seen the Green Street door locked. Kate Alterman, a young worker on the 9th floor, testified that she saw the door locked with a key. She said the foreman had locked it to prevent workers from leaving early. Another survivor, Celia Walker, testified that she had tried the door herself and found it secured. The prosecution also introduced evidence that the key was missing from its usual hook, but Steuer cross-examined the witnesses with brutal precision. He asked them to repeat their stories multiple times, looking for inconsistencies. He pointed out that some witnesses had given different accounts to the press. He suggested they had been coached by union organizers. The jury, composed mostly of businessmen, appeared to waver. The defense argued that the door was not locked. They produced witnesses who claimed they had seen workers pushing through the door during the fire. They also argued that even if the door had been locked, the fire was so fast that it would not have mattered. The key issue was whether the defendants had criminal intent. Steuer painted Blank and Harris as victims of circumstance, men who had built a successful business and who had lost everything in the fire. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On December 27, 1911, they returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators wept. Others shouted in anger. Blank and Harris were free. The verdict was a shock to the public. Newspaper editorials called it a miscarriage of justice. But legally, the case had been weak. The prosecution had not been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Blank and Harris personally knew the door was locked at the exact moment of the fire. The jury may have also been influenced by the class prejudice of the era. Factory owners were seen as upstanding citizens, while immigrant workers were seen as unreliable. The verdict sent a message that corporate negligence could escape punishment. But the acquittal did not end the case. The families of the victims filed civil lawsuits against Blank and Harris. Over the next 2 years, dozens of suits were settled out of court. The total compensation paid to the families was about $75 per death. That is roughly $2,000 in today's money. Blank and Harris had insurance on the factory, and they collected $64,000 from the insurance company. They used the money to reopen a new factory under a different name. They were back in business within a year. In 1913, they were fined $20 for violating child labor laws. The fine was reduced to $10 on appeal. The failure of the criminal trial galvanized the reform movement. If the courts would not hold employers accountable, then the laws themselves had to change. That responsibility fell to the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, established on June 30, 1911. The commission was led by a remarkable group of politicians and activists. The chairman was Robert F. Wagner, a state senator who would later become a United States senator and the author of the National Labor Relations Act. The vice chairman was Al Smith, a state assemblyman who would later become governor of New York and a presidential candidate. The commission also included Frances Perkins, a young social worker who had witnessed the fire from the street. Perkins later became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, as Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. She would carry the lessons of the Triangle Fire into the New Deal. The commission held hearings across the state. They interviewed hundreds of factory workers, many of them young women who described conditions of squalor and danger. They found factories with no fire escapes, with locked doors, with piles of flammable cloth, with no sprinklers, with no drills. They documented children working 12-hour shifts. They found factories where the windows were barred to prevent theft, trapping workers inside. The commission's reports were devastating. They proposed a comprehensive set of reforms: improved fire safety standards, mandatory sprinklers, unlocked exits, fire drills, and regular inspections. They also proposed limits on working hours for women and children, minimum wage laws, and the right of workers to organize. The legislative battle was fierce. Factory owners lobbied against the reforms, arguing that they would drive up costs and destroy business. But the memory of the Triangle Fire was still fresh. Public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of change. In 1912, the New York State Legislature passed the first of the Factory Investigating Commission's bills. Over the next 3 years, they passed more than 30 laws. These laws became the model for factory safety regulations across the United States. By 1914, New York had one of the strongest labor safety codes in the world. The impact was immediate. The number of factory fires in New York City dropped sharply. In 1912, there were 47 fire deaths in factories. In 1913, there were 12. By 1915, the number had fallen to single digits. The laws also had a broader effect. They set a precedent for government intervention in the workplace. Before the Triangle Fire, the prevailing philosophy was laissez-faire. The state should not interfere with business. After the fire, that philosophy began to change. The idea that workers had a right to safety became part of the legal framework. It was a small step, but it was a step toward the modern regulatory state. The Triangle Fire also accelerated the growth of the labor movement. The International Ladies' Garment Workers Union, which had been struggling before 1911, saw a surge in membership. Within a year, the ILGWU had organized thousands of workers in New York's garment district. The union negotiated contracts that included safety provisions. The United Front of Workers, combined with public pressure, forced employers to accept inspections and fire drills. The union also pushed for collective bargaining, which gave workers a voice in their own conditions. But the fight was not limited to New York. The Triangle Fire inspired labor reforms across the country. In Massachusetts, laws were passed requiring fire drills in factories. In Illinois, the state legislature created a factory inspection department. In California, new building codes were enacted. The National Fire Protection Association, which had existed since 1896, gained new influence. They published the first comprehensive standards for factory fire safety in 1903. Those standards evolved into the modern building codes we use today. The fire also changed the way women were viewed in the labor movement. Before 1911, women workers were often seen as temporary, unskilled, and difficult to organize. The Triangle Fire proved that women could be powerful advocates for themselves. The survivors became speakers and activists. Pauline Newman, who had escaped from the 8th floor, became a full-time organizer for the ILGWU. She traveled across the country, telling the story of the fire and demanding better conditions. Rose Schneiderman, a leader of the Women's Trade Union League, gave a famous speech after the fire in which she said, "I would be a traitor to those poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting." That speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It helped shift public opinion. By 1920, many of the worst conditions in New York's garment factories had been eliminated. But the Triangle Fire had revealed a deeper problem: the indifference of the public and the government to the suffering of the poor. Frances Perkins later said that the fire was the day the New Deal was born. She meant that it was the moment when Americans began to accept that government had a responsibility to protect workers. That idea led to the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Each of those laws owes something to the 18 minutes on the ninth floor, and yet, even as reforms were enacted, the fire faded from public memory. By the 193's, the Triangle factory building had been converted to other uses. The survivors grew old. Some died. The story was passed down in families, but it was not taught in schools. It became a footnote in history books. The Great Depression, the World Wars, and the rise of industrial unionism pushed the Triangle Fire into the background. It was not until the 1990's that a new generation rediscovered the story. That rediscovery was driven by historians, but also by the families of the victims. They wanted their ancestors to be remembered. They formed the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition in 2008. They pushed for a memorial at the site. In 2011, on the 100th anniversary, a permanent memorial was dedicated in the park next to the building. The memorial consists of a steel ribbon 9 feet high, engraved with the names of the victims. A garden of flowers surrounds it. Each year on March 25th, a ceremony is held. The names are read aloud. A bell tolls for each one. The sound is solemn and slow. It is the sound that should have been heard that day. But the memorial is more than a monument to the dead. It is a reminder that the struggle for workplace safety is never finished. In the years since the Triangle Fire, there have been other disasters. In 1913, the fire at the Binghamton Clothing Company in New York killed 19. In 1914, the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado killed 24 striking miners and their families. In 1920, the explosion at the Hercules Powder Company in New Jersey killed 26. In 1930, the fire at the Ohio Penitentiary killed 322 inmates. In 1942, the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston killed 492. In 1947, the Texas City disaster killed 581. In 1961, the Hartford Circus fire killed 168. In 1970, the fire at the North American Rockwell plant in California killed 8. In 1981, the fire at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas killed 85. In 1991, the fire at the Imperial Foods plant in North Carolina killed 25. In 1993, the fire at the Cater Toy Factory in Thailand killed 188. In 2005, the fire at the Newton Shirt Factory in Bangladesh killed 6. In 2012, the fire at the Tazreen Garment Factory in Bangladesh killed 112. In 2013, the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh killed 1,134. Each of those disasters had its own causes. Each had its own locked doors. Each had its own failures of inspection, of regulation, of conscience. And each was followed by promises of reform. But the reforms were often delayed or weakened by the same forces that had fought the Triangle Fire laws: cost concerns, political influence, and the belief that profit is more important than life. The Bangladesh garment industry is a particularly stark example. After the Rana Plaza collapse, international brands promised to improve safety. A new agreement was signed, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. It required inspections and repairs, but the accord was not renewed after 2001. Many factories remain unsafe. The global supply chain has made it easy for companies to move production to countries with weaker laws. The workers who sew our clothes today face many of the same conditions as the workers in the Triangle factory. The names are different. The languages are different. But the reality is the same. Locked doors, crowded floors, flammable materials, and the fear that if they complain, they will be fired. The Triangle Fire is not a historical event that we have left behind. It is a warning that we have not fully heeded. The 18 minutes on the ninth floor were not the last time workers were trapped by greed. They were not the last time the public was shocked and then forgot. They were not the last time the system failed. And so the question, what locked doors exist today, is not rhetorical. It is a question that demands answers. It demands that we look at the factories in our own communities, at the warehouses where we order packages, at the farms that produce our food. It demands that we ask who is locked in and who is locking the door. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened on March 25, 1911. It lasted 18 minutes. It killed 146 people, but its meaning extends far beyond that day. It is a story of failure and courage, of tragedy and reform, of forgetting and remembering. It is a story that ends not with a verdict or a law, but with a question that each generation must answer. What happened in those 18 minutes is known. What we do with that knowledge is still being written. At 10 a.m. on April 11, 1911, in the Supreme Court of New York County, a grand jury convened to hear evidence against the owners of the Triangle Waste Company. The proceedings were held in a room on the second floor of the courthouse. The windows were open. The spring air drifted in, but the atmosphere inside was heavy. The district attorney, Charles S. Whitman, had assembled dozens of witnesses: survivors, firefighters, inspectors, and family members. Each was asked to describe what they had seen. The grand jury would decide whether Max Blank and Isaac Harris should be charged with manslaughter. The charges were based on a single death, that of Margaret Schwartz, a 24-year-old cutter who had been trapped on the ninth floor. Her body was found near a locked door. The prosecution argued that the owners knew the door was locked but did nothing to change it. The defense argued that the door was not locked. They said it was simply stuck. The grand jury listened for 3 days. They heard from a young woman named Katie Weiner. She had escaped from the ninth floor. She testified that she had seen the door to the Washington Place staircase closed and locked. She said she tried to open it but could not. Another survivor, Mary Buccelli, said the same. She had seen the door bolted from the inside. The fire department testified that they found the door locked when they arrived. The owners, lawyers, brought their own witnesses. Some employees said the door was never locked during working hours. The grand jury weighed the conflicting accounts. On April 14th, they indicted Harris and Blank on 7 counts of manslaughter, 1 for each floor where victims had died, but the trial would focus on 1 victim. But the grand jury was only the beginning. The case would go to trial in December. The owners were released on bail. Each posted a bond of $5,000. They returned to their offices on the 9th floor of the Ash Building. The building had been repaired. New windows were installed. The doors were unlocked. Some of the machinery was still in place. Harris and Blank continued to operate their business. They moved production to a new location in Brooklyn. They claimed they were the victims of a public frenzy. They insisted that the fire had been caused by a careless smoker, not by their negligence. The city's newspapers printed their statements. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the owners were guilty. Others thought they were being scapegoated for a tragic accident. The trial began on December 4, 1911, in the Court of General Sessions in Manhattan. The judge was Thomas C. O'Sullivan. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney J. Robert Rubin. The defense was led by a team of skilled lawyers, including Max D. Steuer, a former state senator who specialized in labor cases. The courtroom was packed. Survivors sat in the gallery. Some had to be helped up the stairs because they were still recovering from burns. The jury was composed of 11 men and 1 woman. The woman, Mrs. Julia Gold, was the first woman ever to serve on a jury in New York City in a capital case. The trial would last 3 weeks. The prosecution opened by describing the scene on the ninth floor. They showed the jury a diagram of the building. They pointed to the Green Street staircase, which had been blocked by fire. They pointed to the Washington Place staircase, where the door had been locked. They described the elevators, the single fire escape, the collapse. They called dozens of witnesses. One of the most powerful was a young woman named Rose Friedman. She had been working on the ninth floor when the fire started. She was near the Washington Place door. She tried to open it. It would not budge. She screamed. A man tried to force it open. It would not move. She then turned and ran to the Green Street side. She found the exit blocked by flames. She eventually jumped into the elevator shaft, landing on the car. She broke her leg. She survived. She told the jury that the door was locked. She had no doubt. Another key witness was a firefighter named John McTague. He testified that when he arrived on the ninth floor, he found the Washington Place door locked. He had to use his axe to break it down. He said the lock was a heavy iron bolt. He found a key in the lock. The key was on the Washington Place staircase side. He turned the key, but the bolt would not move. He had to force the door with his shoulder. The prosecution used this testimony to argue that the door was not merely stuck. It was intentionally locked. The key could only be turned from outside. That meant someone had locked it from the stairwell side, not from inside the factory. This supported the theory that the owners had locked the door to keep workers from leaving early. The defense attacked the credibility of the survivors. They pointed out that many witnesses were union members. The union had been trying to organize the Triangle factory for years. The defense argued that the survivors were biased. They also brought their own witnesses. A machinist named Louis Senderman testified that he had seen the door open and close normally on the day of the fire. Another worker, Joseph Goldstein, said he had used the door just minutes before the fire started. He said it was unlocked. The defense suggested that the survivors had been confused by the chaos. They said that in the panic, people had mistakenly believed the door was locked, when in fact it was simply jammed by the heat or by the bodies pressing against it. The trial became a battle of memories. The jury had to decide who was telling the truth. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Harris and Blank knew the door was locked and that their negligence caused the death of Margaret Schwartz. The defense argued that the owners could not have known the door was locked because it was not locked. They said the fire was an accident that no one could have prevented. They pointed to the fact that the Ash building had been built to code. The owners had passed inspections. The fire department had never cited them for locked doors. The defense painted the owners as hardworking businessmen who had been unfairly targeted. On December 27, 1911, the jury began deliberation. They returned after 2 hours. They found Max Blank and Isaac Harris not guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Survivors wept. The owners hugged their lawyers. The judge thanked the jury. The verdict was met with fury by the labor movement and by many New Yorkers. The New York Times wrote that the verdict was a disappointment to those who hoped for a conviction. The New York World called it a travesty of justice. The ILGWU organized a protest march. Thousands of workers marched through the streets of Manhattan. They carried signs that said, "We demand justice and locked doors kill." But the verdict stood. The owners walked free. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the law of the time. Manslaughter charges in New York required proof that the defendant had a specific intent to harm, or that their negligence was willful and wanton. The prosecution had to show that Harris and Blank knew the door was locked and deliberately left it locked. The defense successfully sowed doubt. They had witnesses who said the door was not locked. The jury may have also been influenced by the fact that the owners were wealthy and well-connected. They had hired the best lawyers. The trial was held in a climate where business owners were rarely held criminally liable for workplace deaths. In 1911, industrial accidents were often treated as unavoidable tragedies. The legal system was not designed to protect workers. It was designed to protect property. But the acquittal did not end the story. The families of the victims filed civil lawsuits against Harris and Blank. They sued for wrongful death. In 1913, a civil jury awarded damages to the family of a victim named Margaret O'Leary. The amount was $75. That was the standard amount allowed under New York law for the death of a wage earner. The families received a total of about $3,000 in settlements. The owners paid less than $100 per life. Harris and Blank had collected insurance on the factory. They received over $60,000 from the insurance company. They made a profit from the fire. The civil cases revealed more about the owner's conduct. During the insurance investigation, it was discovered that Harris and Blank had been cited multiple times by the factory inspector before the fire. They had been warned about locked doors, blocked aisles, and insufficient fire drills. They had ignored the warnings. The insurance company later alleged fraud. They claimed that the owners had deliberately left the factory unguarded and that the fire had been set to collect the insurance. No arson charges were ever filed, but the suspicion lingered. The owners continued to run their business. They opened a new factory under a different name. They were fined $50 for a safety violation in 1903. They paid the fine and moved on. The public did not forget. The acquittal led to new calls for criminal negligence laws. In 1914, New York State passed a law that made it easier to prosecute employers for workplace deaths. The law created a new category of manslaughter called criminal negligence in the workplace. It required only that the employer had failed to provide a safe workplace, not that they had specific intent. That law was used in later cases, but it still required proof of knowledge. The burden remained high. In the years that followed, the Triangle Fire became a symbol of injustice. The owners were not punished, but the movement they had tried to suppress grew stronger. The ILGWU used the fire to organize thousands of workers. By 1915, the union had over 100,000 members in New York City alone. They demanded better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. They went on strike. They won contracts. The fire had made the union a permanent force in the garment industry. But the fire also changed the way Americans thought about government. The idea that the state had a responsibility to protect workers from dangerous conditions became mainstream. Frances Perkins, who had watched the fire from the street, became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. As Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, she helped create the Social Security system, the minimum wage, and the 40-hour workweek. She often said that the Triangle Fire was the day that the New Deal was born. She meant that the fire had shown the public that private industry could not be trusted to protect workers on its own. Government had to step in. The fire also had a direct impact on building codes. The New York City Fire Department revised its inspection procedures. New laws required factory doors to swing outward. They required fire drills at least once every 3 months. They required automatic sprinklers in buildings over a certain height. The National Fire Protection Association published its first standard for factory fire safety in 1903. That standard became the basis for the International Building Code. The concepts of exit capacity, fire-resistant materials, and compartmentalization were developed in response to the Triangle Fire. The locked door became a metaphor for all the ways that systems can fail. But the fire also had a darker legacy. It exposed the limits of reform. The owners were acquitted. The victims' families received almost nothing. The building where the fire occurred, the Ash Building, still stands. It is now a landmark. It is part of New York University. It is used as a classroom building. There is a plaque on the outside. It reads, "On this site, 146 workers died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire." Their deaths led to new laws for fire safety and workers' rights. The plaque is small. It is easy to miss. The building does not have a museum. The ninth floor is now a computer lab. The windows are sealed. The doors are automatic. The fire escapes have been removed. The past is invisible. Yet every year on March 25th, a ceremony is held in the park next to the building. The names are read aloud. The bell tolls. The sound is the same as it was in 1909. For 111 years, that sound has been repeated. The survivors are gone. The last survivor, a woman named Rose Friedman who escaped by jumping into the elevator shaft, died in 2001 at the age of 107. She had spent her later years speaking about the fire. She said she never forgot the sound of the flames. She never forgot the locked door. The Triangle Fire remains relevant not because it was the worst industrial disaster in American history. It was not. The 1911 fire in the Equitable Building in New York killed 6. The 1912 fire in the New York City Department of Correction killed 10. The 1913 fire at the Binghamton Clothing Company killed 19. The 1914 fire at the Ohio Penitentiary killed over 300. But the Triangle Fire was unique because it happened at a time when the public was ready to listen. The labor movement was growing. Women were demanding the vote. Progressive reformers were gaining power. The fire became a catalyst. It pushed the country toward a new understanding of social responsibility. That understanding has been tested many times since. In 1991, the Imperial Foods plant in Hamlet, North Carolina, caught fire. 25 workers died. The doors were locked. The company had no fire alarms. The owners were charged with manslaughter. They pleaded guilty and received sentences of up to 19 years, but the plant had been inspected only once in its history. The inspector had missed the locked doors. The fire happened because the company wanted to prevent theft, the same motive as in 1909. In 2012, the Tazreen garment factory in Bangladesh caught fire. 112 workers died. The doors were locked. The building had no sprinklers. The fire escapes were blocked. The company had been warned by inspectors, but nothing was done. The brand that owned the factory, a subsidiary of Walmart, had not enforced safety standards. The factory continued to operate because the cost of making repairs was higher than the cost of ignoring them. The global supply chain had made it possible for companies to outsource risk to countries with weak laws. In 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Bangladesh. 1,134 workers died. The building had been built on a swamp. It was constructed without a permit. The owners had added 3 extra floors illegally. The workers had complained about cracks in the walls. They were told to come to work anyway. The building collapsed at 8:57 a.m. The deaths were nearly entirely preventable. The international outcry led to the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. That accord was a binding agreement between brands and unions. It required inspections and repairs. It was considered a success, but it expired in 2002. It was replaced by a weaker, non-binding agreement. Many factories remain unsafe. The Triangle Fire reminds us that the fight for workplace safety is never permanent. Progress can be reversed. Laws can be weakened. Public memory can fade. The only defense is vigilance. That vigilance requires us to question the systems we rely on. It requires us to ask who is locking the doors today. At 4:45 p.m. on March 25, 1911, the last body was removed from the ash building. The coroner put the final count at 146. 123 women and 23 men. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 48. Their names are now engraved on a steel ribbon in the park. The ribbon is 9 feet high. It curves around a garden. The names are in the order of the floors: 9th floor, 8th floor, 10th floor. Some names are repeated. There were sisters, there were mothers and daughters. There were immigrants from Italy, Russia, Poland, and Germany. They had come to America for a better life. They found a locked door. The fire lasted 18 minutes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The legal reforms took years. The memorial took a century. The question remains: what happened in those 18 minutes is known. What we do with that knowledge is still being written. The question remains: what happened in those 18 minutes is known. What we do with that knowledge is still being written. But to understand the full weight of that knowledge, we must examine not only the fire itself but the structures that allowed it to happen and the structures that eventually changed because of it. We must look at the people who died, the people who survived, the people who prosecuted, the people who defended, and the people who legislated. We must also look at the people who forgot. At 9:30 p.m. on March 25, 1911, the first meeting of what would become the Factory Investigating Commission was held informally in the office of the New York State Legislature. The commission was not created by law yet, but the political will was already forming. The next morning, newspapers across the country ran photographs of the bodies laid out on the sidewalk. The public outrage was visceral. Within a week, Governor John Alden Dix appointed the New York State Factory Investigating Commission. Its members included Francis Perkins, then a young social worker, and Robert F. Wagner, a state senator from New York City. The commission had subpoena power. It could inspect any factory in the state. It could compel testimony. It could recommend legislation, nothing like it had ever existed before. Over the next 3 years, the commission held dozens of hearings. It inspected over 2,000 factories. It found locked doors, blocked exits, piled up fabric, and broken sprinklers in hundreds of buildings. It found children working piecework in tenement apartments. It found women sewing in basements with no ventilation. It found men operating machinery without guards. The commission's reports were detailed and damning. They were also widely read. The public was horrified again, not by a single fire but by a system of neglect. The commission's work led to the passage of the New York State Labor Law of 1903. That law required factory owners to install automatic sprinkler systems in buildings over a certain height. It required fire drills at least once a month. It required that all factory doors be kept unlocked during working hours. It required that fire escapes be built of non-combustible material and be accessible from every floor. It required that exit doors swing outward. It required that no more than 100 square feet of floor space be allowed per worker in any workroom. It required that all machinery be guarded. It required that children under 14 not be employed in factories. It required that women not be required to work more than 9 hours a day or 54 hours a week. It required that factories be inspected at least once a year. These requirements seem basic now. In 1913, they were revolutionary. They were the first comprehensive labor laws in the United States. They became a model for other states. By 1920, 20 states had passed similar laws. By 1930, 40 states had. The federal government did not pass a national law until the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. That law was itself a direct descendant of the Triangle Fire. But the laws themselves were only part of the story. The laws had to be enforced. The New York State Department of Labor had to hire inspectors. The inspectors had to be trained. The factories had to learn to comply. The process was slow. Many factory owners resisted. They argued that the laws were too expensive. They argued that the government had no right to interfere with private business. They argued that workers should be free to accept whatever conditions they chose. These arguments were old. They had been used in 1911 to defend the Triangle factory. They were used again in 1903. They are used still today. What happened in the years after the fire was not a simple arc of progress. There were setbacks. In 1914, a fire at the Binghamton Clothing Company in Binghamton, New York killed 19 workers. The factory had been inspected under the new laws. The inspectors had found the exits blocked. The factory had promised to fix them. The owner had not. The fire happened anyway. The owner was charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 months in prison. The conviction was appealed. It was overturned on a technicality. The owner never served time. The families of the victims received nothing. In 1916, a fire at the Chattanooga Stove Works in Chattanooga, Tennessee killed 21 workers. The factory had no fire escapes. The doors were locked. The owner was charged with involuntary manslaughter. The jury acquitted him after 10 minutes of deliberation. The jury said the workers should have known the risks. The same logic had been used in the Triangle trial. In 1929, a fire at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio killed 123 people. The building had no sprinklers. The exits were unmarked. The fire started in the basement of the clinic. The smoke rose through the ventilation ducts. The patients and staff on the upper floors did not know what was happening. The clinic had no fire alarm. The building had been inspected by the city fire department twice in the previous year. The inspectors had noted that there were no fire drills. They had noted that the exit signs were missing. They had noted that the stairwells were used for storage, but no follow-up inspection was scheduled. The clinic continued to operate. The fire happened. The owners were not charged. The building was rebuilt with modern safety features, but the deaths could not be undone. These cases show that the Triangle Fire did not solve the problem of workplace safety. It only began the conversation. The conversation continued through the 20th century. In 1942, the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston killed 492 people. The exits were locked. The building had no sprinklers. The fire started in a basement lounge. The owner had blocked the exits to prevent patrons from leaving without paying. The fire spread in minutes. The building had been inspected by the city fire department 4 months before the fire. The inspectors had noted that the exit doors were locked. They had noted that the doors opened inward. They had noted that there were no emergency lights, but no action was taken. The owner was charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. He served 4 years and was paroled. The building code for nightclubs was rewritten. The fire code for public assembly spaces was strengthened across the country. In 1951, the fire at the Mandel Brothers department store in Chicago killed 28 people. The building had a sprinkler system, but it had been disconnected during renovations. The exit doors were locked. The fire alarms did not work. The building had been inspected by the city fire department 3 times in the year before the fire. The inspectors had noted the disconnected sprinkler but had not issued a violation. The department store was acquitted of any criminal liability. The city of Chicago revised its inspection procedures. The fire code for retail buildings was updated. In 1977, the fire at the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate, Kentucky, killed 165 people. The building had no sprinklers. The fire exits were blocked by furniture. The fire started in a newly constructed room that had never been wired for smoke detectors. The building had been inspected by the state fire marshal 1 year before the fire. The inspector had noted that there were no emergency lights. He had noted that the exit signs were missing. He had noted that the doors opened inward. He had noted that there was no fire alarm. The owner had promised to fix these problems. The owner did not. The fire happened. The owner was charged with involuntary manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served 3 years and was paroled. The building code for places of public assembly was rewritten again. These are not just historical footnotes. They are the same pattern. A business prioritizes profit over safety. A building inspector misses a violation. A regulator fails to follow up. A fire breaks out. People die. The public is outraged. Laws are passed. The memory fades. The pattern repeats. Why does it repeat? Because the fundamental conflict between profit and safety does not change. The owner of Triangle Shirtwaist, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were not evil men in the sense that they wanted workers to die. They wanted to make money. They saw safety as a cost, not an investment. They locked the doors to prevent theft. They piled fabric near the machines to increase productivity. They hired workers who were young, female, and immigrant because they could pay them less. They fought the union because unions demanded better pay and safer conditions. They were not monsters. They were businessmen acting in their own interest. The system allowed them to do so, and when the fire happened, the system protected them. The prosecutor did not bring charges that would stick. The jury did not convict. The law did not hold them accountable. That is the lesson of the Triangle Fire. It is not that one set of owners were bad. It is that the system was designed to protect them. It was designed to protect the owners, not the workers. The laws were weak. The inspections were rare. The penalties were small. The workers had no power. They could not strike because they would be fired. They could not organize because the union was weak. They could not vote because women did not have the right to vote. They could not sue because the law of negligence required proof of specific intent. They could not appeal because they were dead. That is why the fire matters. It forced the system to change. But the system changed only because the public demanded it. And the public demanded it because they saw the bodies. They saw the photographs. They read the newspaper accounts. They attended the funerals. They marched in the streets. They voted for politicians who promised reform. They made the fire a symbol. What happened after that was not inevitable. It was the result of political will. The Factory Investigating Commission was created because the governor was pressured. The labor laws were passed because enough legislators were afraid of losing their seats. The inspections were funded because the public demanded accountability. The fire code was enforced because the fire department was given more power. None of this happened automatically. It happened because people organized, and they organized because they remembered. The survivors of the Triangle Fire made sure of that. They spoke at union rallies. They testified before legislative committees. They marched in parades. They gave interviews to reporters. They told their stories to schoolchildren. They kept the memory alive, but memory fades. Survivors die. In 2001, Rose Friedman died. She was the last living survivor of the Triangle Fire. She had been a 14-year-old worker on the ninth floor. She had escaped by jumping into the elevator shaft as the elevator car passed. She had broken her back. She had spent months in the hospital. She had spent the rest of her life telling the story. She said the fire had changed everything. She said it had given her a purpose. She said she wanted people to remember. After her death, the story became history. It was taught in schools. It was written in books. It was discussed in documentaries, but it no longer had a living voice. The memory began to recede. The building was renovated. The plaque was placed. The ceremonies continued. But the public attention shifted to other disasters. In 2001, the September 11th attacks occurred. The World Trade Center towers collapsed after being struck by hijacked planes. Nearly 3,000 people died. The event dominated public consciousness for years. The Triangle Fire seemed distant and small by comparison. In 2008, the financial crisis began. Millions of people lost their jobs and homes. The labor movement lost ground. The fire code became a matter of professional regulation, not public debate. But the Triangle Fire never really disappeared. It remained a reference point. In 2012, when the Tazreen fire killed 112 workers in Bangladesh, the comparisons to Triangle were immediate. The same words were used: locked doors, blocked exits, no sprinklers, young women, immigrant workforce, global supply chain. The same outrage was felt. The same demand for reform was made. And the same pattern of resistance followed. The brands blamed the factory owners. The factory owners blamed the government. The government blamed the brands. No one took full responsibility. Some repairs were made. Some agreements were signed. But the underlying conditions did not fundamentally change. In 2013, when the Rana Plaza building collapsed, the death toll was so large that it forced a different kind of response. The International Labor Organization helped negotiate the Accord on Fire and Building Safety. It covered over 2,000 factories. It required independent inspections. It required binding commitments. It required transparency. It was considered a breakthrough. But the accord was not renewed in 2020. It was replaced by a voluntary initiative. The factories that had been inspected were safer, but the factories that had never been inspected remained dangerous. The supply chain had shifted to other countries with weak enforcement. The problem did not disappear. It moved. What does that tell us? It tells us that the fight for workplace safety is not a single battle. It is a perpetual struggle. Each generation must learn the lesson again. Each generation must demand accountability. Each generation must ask the question, who is locking the doors today? That question is not rhetorical. There are locked doors in factories today. There are blocked exits. There are missing sprinklers. There are overworked, underpaid, vulnerable workers. They are in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, India, Ethiopia, Honduras, and in factories in the United States. They are in warehouses, meat-packing plants, laundries, and call centers. They are in the supply chains of the brands we buy. They are invisible to most of us, but they are there. The Triangle Fire is a reminder that we cannot afford to look away. 18 minutes on the ninth floor changed the world, but the world has a way of changing back. The locked door remains a symbol of all the ways that systems can fail. The only way to keep it unlocked is to keep watch. That means asking questions. It means demanding inspections. It means supporting unions. It means voting for politicians who enforce safety laws. It means remembering that the workers who died in 1911 were not statistics. They were people. Their names are still read aloud every year. The bell still tolls. The ceremony still takes place. It takes place in the park next to the Ash Building. The building is now part of New York University. The ninth floor is a computer lab. The windows are sealed. The doors are automatic. The fire escapes are gone, but the park is still there. The names are engraved on a steel ribbon. The ribbon curves around a garden. The names are in the order of the floors. Ninth floor, eighth floor, 10th floor. Some names are repeated. There were sisters, there were mothers and daughters. There were immigrants from Italy, Russia, Poland, and Germany. They had come to America for a better life. They found a locked door. The fire lasted 18 minutes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The legal reforms took years. The memorial took a century. The question remains. What happened in those 18 minutes is known. What we do with that knowledge is still being written. We write it every time we inspect a factory. We write it every time we pass a fire safety law. We write it every time we support a union. We write it every time we refuse to buy from a brand that does not enforce safety standards. We write it every time we remember the names. The writing is never finished. The fire is never fully extinguished. It burns in memory. It burns in law. It burns in the stories we tell. This is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present. The Triangle Fire of 1911 is still happening. It is happening in every factory where the doors are locked. It is happening in every building where the sprinklers are missing. It is happening in every workplace where the workers are afraid to speak. The fire is still burning. The question is whether we will put it out. The answer is not simple. It requires action at every level. It requires government regulation. It requires corporate accountability. It requires worker organization. It requires public pressure. It requires remembering that the 18 minutes on the ninth floor were not an accident. They were a choice. The choice was made by the owners. The choice to prevent the next fire is ours. And so, at 4:45 p.m. on March 25, 1911, the last body was removed from the Ash Building. The coroner put the final count at 146, 123 women and 23 men. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 48. Their names are still read aloud. The bell still tolls. The ceremony still takes place. And the question still remains. What happened in those 18 minutes is known. What we do with that knowledge is still being written. Let us write it carefully. Let us write it with the memory of every worker who died. Let us write it so that the next generation will not have to ask the same question. Let us write it so that the doors will never be locked again. On December 4, 1911, the trial of Max Blank and Isaac Harris began in the Supreme Court of New York County. They were charged with manslaughter in the first degree. The indictment covered the deaths of 23 victims on the ninth floor. The state argued that the defendants knowingly locked the exit door, that they knew the fire escape was inadequate, that they failed to maintain a working sprinkler system, and that they had a history of ignoring safety complaints. The prosecution called 150 witnesses. The defense called 100. The trial lasted 3 weeks. At 11:30 a.m. on December 27, 1911, the jury retired. They deliberated for about 2 hours. At 1:15 p.m. they returned. The foreman read the verdict, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators sobbed, others shouted. Harris and Blank did not react. They left the courthouse through a side door. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Some cheered, others cursed. The verdict was reported on front pages across the country. The New York Times called it a legal anomaly. The socialist newspaper The Call called it a miscarriage of justice. What happened? The judge had instructed the jury that they could convict only if they found that the defendants had knowledge that the door was locked at the time of the fire. The defense argued that the door was locked by a foreman without the owner's authorization. The defense also argued that the owners were not present at the time. The jury believed them. It was a narrow reading of the law, but it was the law. The verdict was a shock to the public. It was a shock to the labor movement. It was a shock to the families of the victims. They had watched the trial. They had testified. They had hoped for justice. They did not get it. The owners went free. They reopened their business under a new name. They collected $50,000 from insurance settlements. Their workers received nothing, but the trial was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something larger. The public outrage over the acquittal fueled a movement. The same month the trial ended, the New York State Legislature appointed the Factory Investigating Commission. It was given broad powers to inspect workplaces, to hold hearings, to recommend new laws. The commission was led by Robert F. Wagner, a state senator, and Alfred E. Smith, a state assemblyman. Both went on to become governors. Wagner later wrote the National Labor Relations Act. Smith was a presidential candidate. They were shaped by the Triangle Fire. The commission investigated every industry in New York. They interviewed thousands of workers. They photographed filthy factories and deadly stairwells. They exposed the conditions that had allowed the fire to happen. Their reports were detailed and damning. They proposed a series of bills. In 1912, the New York State Legislature passed the first comprehensive factory safety laws in the United States. They required automatic sprinklers in factories. They required fire drills. They required unlocked doors that opened outward. They required adequate fire escapes. They required regular inspections. They imposed penalties for violations. For the first time, factory owners could be fined or jailed for endangering workers. The laws were not perfect. They were not fully enforced, but they were a start. Other states began to follow. By 1915, more than 20 states had passed similar laws. The Triangle Fire had become a national catalyst, yet the legal system remained flawed. Harris and Blank were never held criminally responsible. They were sued civilly. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits. Most settled out of court for $75 per victim. That was the amount allowed by law at the time. A worker's life was worth $75. Blank and Harris paid. They also paid insurance claims. They made a profit. They remained wealthy. They remained in business. One of them later opened another shirtwaist factory. It had locked doors. It was inspected. It was fined. It was shut down, but he kept going. The injustice of the trial lingered. It still lingers. It is a reminder that corporate accountability is not automatic. It must be demanded. It must be enforced. The law is only as good as the people who uphold it. How could this have happened? The trial reveals a deeper failure. The legal system was built to protect property, not people. The jury was composed of property owners and businessmen. They saw the defendants as fellow entrepreneurs. They sympathized with the difficulty of running a factory. They viewed the workers as careless or unlucky. They did not see them as victims of a preventable crime. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence of locked doors and blocked exits, but the defense turned the narrative around. They blamed the workers for panicking. They blamed the foreman for locking the door. They blamed the fire chief for not inspecting the building. They deflected responsibility. The jury accepted it. The Triangle Fire is not only a story of a fire. It is a story of a system that failed to hold the powerful accountable. It is a story of a public that refused to accept that failure. The reforms that followed were not given by the powerful. They were taken by the people. They were demanded by unions, by suffragists, by muckrakers, by ordinary citizens who refused to forget. The question remains, what has changed? The laws are better. The inspections are more frequent. The penalties are higher. But the pattern of impunity persists. When a garment factory collapses in Bangladesh, no executive is convicted. When a mining company causes a disaster, no CEO goes to prison. When a warehouse is unsafe and workers die, the fine is paid and the business continues. The scale is different, but the logic is the same. The Triangle Fire matters because it shows us what is possible. It shows us that outrage can become law. It shows us that memory can become action. It shows us that the locked door can be opened. But it also shows us how easily the door can be locked again. The trial ended in acquittal. The reforms began. The fire burned for 18 minutes. The memory burns for more than a century. And still, we write. We write so the next generation will not have to ask the same question. We write so that the doors will never be locked again.